Thank you, Simon. Good afternoon, everybody. I don't, for those of you who like them, I'm afraid I don't have any PowerPoint slides with me. I thought I'd just sort of talk through the experiences that we as company De Beers have had by ourselves, and also in relation to the partnerships we have with other members of the private sector, but more increasingly, and certainly with our experience in the Kimberley process and conflict diamonds over the past 10 years, extending those partnerships to very productive engagements with civil society and also governments. Just on a background, De Beers is an African company. It's 120 years old. We hadn't actually, and this is where we're sort of depart a bit from the experience, we hadn't actually mined diamonds in any country of conflict, and we've been operational in the outside market that's buying diamonds in the bush, as it were. I suppose there the only example we had was with Angola when we were in partnership with the Angolan government in Luanda on that. So, but we do have a lot of experience with governments, with civil society, and with other members of the private sector that have been involved directly in a lot of conflicts as well. And of course, conflict diamonds is very central to that. Diana talked about the cost of conflict. One thing I'd have to begin with, and I think for those of us in the private sector, it's sort of just a given, but to remind ourselves, the cost of doing business in an area of conflict is horrendous. It is enormous, and it shouldn't be underestimated. Because the basic truth is that long-term business investment thrives best in a predictable, benign environment. And it is, therefore, in the best interest of business to do all it can to achieve that. Personally, I'm very much encouraged by initiatives that you spoke of, Simon, last year, for example, with the launch that Douglas Alexander did, and when Varda joined him on that, to try and get the private sector more involved in these issues, and working therefore alongside government, this virtuous troika, as I would describe it, government, civil society and business, working together with relatively the same objectives. It will always be the tactics that we will disagree on, but the objectives are remarkably similar. And this is the lesson we learned from the Kimberley process, which is what I'd like to just focus on, if I may, this evening. As I said earlier, business thrives best in a stable environment, and no more than we in the extractive industries. For example, with a diamond mine, there is a 30-year period of return on investment. First of all, it takes you about 10 years to find an economic mine. It takes you 10 years then to develop it, and then a further 10 years to actually get any return on profit. In that time, you've invested between $1 and $1.5 billion. So certainly for us in the extractive industries, and particularly for us in the diamond industry, that stable environment is an absolute. Just to give you some idea, when our exploration teams are out there, to date, since man first discovered primary deposits, that's where diamonds are found in these ancient volcanic cones, there have been something like 6,000 of these kimberlite pipes found. Fewer than 13 of them have actually been economical. So again, it's a very risky, very capital-intensive venture. What we've learned through the Kimberley process is that no one sector alone can deliver solutions to the challenges that we all face, and in particular in developing areas. And again, I will be concentrating mainly on Africa. But of course, these challenges are felt everywhere, in South America, in Asia as well. And when we were first challenged with the concept of conflict diamonds, it was, I have to say, probably one of the steepest learning curves that we were on. We had already began work with the United Nations in the imposition of political and economic sanctions against UNITA in Angola. And it hadn't occurred to us that there was a wider stakeholder grouping that we needed to positively engage with. And the NGOs, for their part as well, they came and I think they learned a lot about the dynamics of our peculiar, unique industry. And the government, also, we had some champions and we had some laggards as well. So I think it was a learning curve for all of us, but one that I think 10 years down the line we'll think that was well worth climbing. And I think what makes the Kimberley process special and how it addressed sort of conflict as well is by engaging those governments that were affected by it. There was no sort of ivory tower approach to this. The real leaders on this was the government of Angola, was Sierra Leone, and in fact it was Sierra Leone just as the conflict was coming to an end there that the industry engaged directly with to develop the first prototype Kimberley process certification scheme. So it was that engagement which was vitally important, but no more so than that with the between business and civil society and the local community. And I think it was that help that brought us to the point where we now can deem a qualified success for the Kimberley process. What made it success, what has been the successful side of it, I think, has been the collaboration, the engagement. We've been very lucky. I think all sectors led it with good faith. The NGOs, I think, approached it at, I think, a great risk. When you look at 10 years ago, how difficult it was for civil society to engage directly with the with business sector. And I think they took some very courageous decisions and some great risks in coming along in this collaborative effort. And I think the governments were well led. I think the British government was exceptional in its leadership. At that time under Peter Hain, who was in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. The Canadians, the Commission, and also, not forgetting, Africa itself. South Africa took the lead on this, and I think it was important that African nations did take the lead on it, and this is some of the lessons that we sort of learn maybe with something like EITI, is that you have to allow these countries that are affected by these issues to be leading the solutions and providing the solutions. I can think of no better example of NEPAD at work and successful than the Kimberley process. The British government did make one mistake, which was to take the initiative in about sort of 2000, 2001, and the South Africans sent the diplomatic version of the caretaker to that, and to their credit, the British government got the message and allowed the shift of power back to Africa. But I think going beyond the Kimberley process, I say the successes that it's brought is that its pragmatic nature, its flexibility, the good faith that is allowed to grow amongst the various sectors involved. I think on the negative side, we've still got a long way to go. I think probably the biggest positive, we're still here 6 years on, but we've still got a long journey ahead of us. That's why we meet two times a year in order to address the issues. And we talk about conflict in a very traditional way. The definition of conflict diamonds, for example, is those diamonds that are used by rebel organizations to undermine a legitimately recognized government. But we had an interesting challenge to that with the recent events of human rights abuses in Zimbabwe, where the Zimbabwean government turned that on its head, and it was the government inflicting human rights abuses on its own people. So that presented us with a great challenge. The challenges that we have had all along the journey and that we will have in the future, I'm sure. But again, the nature of the Kimberley process allowed the flexibility for industry and NGOs to engage. And we were able to agree on the formulation of words that we will now take together, industry and NGOs, to the government's plenary in November to ensure that human rights are fully recognised within the Kimberley process framework. So that's the Kimberley process providing technical solutions. Now getting back to the whole thing of conflict, and again I think for us it's conflict prevention. I couldn't claim that the Kimberley process single-handedly brought conflict to an end in Angola or Sierra Leone or DRC. but it was certainly a contributory factor. What the Kimberley process can do, and organisations like it, is work in the area of prevention. However, it's got to work in relation to other organisations as well. And this is what we're finding. The Kimberley process by itself is not a magic bullet, just the same as EITI is not a magic bullet against corruption. And so what we have to achieve is greater cooperation between governments, those arms of governments, and to bring organisations like the Kimberley process closer to the heart of government. And it will not work unless it does that. At the same time, we've got to stop knocking the Kimberley process per se, and recognise that the Kimberley process is not the problem, but it's the lack of political support and logistics and resources that is not allowing it to reach its full potential. As I say, in spite of those many successes, it could still be a lot better. And this is what we would advocate in the lessons we've learned, is engagement right along the line, the value chain. It's important that an industry is united. We would never have been able to achieve what we did achieve as an industry if we had not united and behind the World Diamond Council. Excuse me. And it's very important that we have this cross-pollination as well between the various organisations that are out there, seemingly at first doing very different jobs, but when you look at them, they overlap. Corruption, for example, is not only something that is there in peacetime, but leading up to conflict, during conflict, and it's so difficult to get rid of it afterwards. I lived for 6 years in Zaire under Mobutu, the greatest kleptocracy of all time. And it is so difficult to get it once it's in the culture. It's so difficult to get it out. So all of these things you have to address. And one thing that we find as a business working on the ground and having that investment as well is that business has to get away from what I'd call the model where you have this just like a castle model, if you like, where you have ringed off the business. You're inside, you're talking earlier on, I think these are about clinics, provisions for local, just for employees and things like that. I'm not saying you necessarily have to go out and be a charity, but certainly it is in your business interest to engage positively. Not just to engage with the community, but to be part of it as well. So what you do is you smooth out that castle model, and you smooth it out into positive, full engagement with local communities. This empowers the communities as well. One of the big problems with those vulnerable communities in those areas of the alluvial diggings was that they had no structure, they had no support. And again, you were talking earlier on about Simon, support for local companies, SMEs. This is a vital part, and I think a role that business can play that has so far not been properly tapped. And when it's easy for us to withdraw, should we take do that analysis, that risk, it's easy for us to pull away, but we leave behind people who are trying to run their own businesses as well. And they require support. And it's not just from charities, not just from NGOs, but business can support them as well. Business can support them with organisation. And we found that if you empower communities, you empower people, then certainly you are a person who is providing those solutions and you're supporting that. So I think, and I like the example of the businesses in the Caucasus as well. I think that's another example that I will reiterate that point, that unless the business itself agrees with the objectives, you're not ever going to reach any objective at all. You will end up pleasing nobody. And I think that's why the Kimberley process itself is much lauded and seen as an example of the way forward, but what it's not on the receiving end of is a united industry in whatever sector you care to see, with the exception perhaps of the forestry industry. So I will leave it there on that point. As I say, I think the lesson that we come away with is engagement horizontally as well as vertically with those people that not only your business affects, but also affect your business. And we think that it only makes sense to be able to do that. And that is something which we haven't got all the answers to, and we're still learning. And I think we've learned more in the past 10 years through engaging and going out to places and talking to people that we didn't talk to for the 110 years before that. I think it's something which I see, and I'm encouraged to see a lot of businesses and private sector doing now, and I really do welcome the very much more positive response that we're having from civil society as business. You know, we're not the barbarians at the gate. It is in our interest to have that benign, stable environment. And I also welcome very much the recent moves by DFID as well to engage and embrace the private sector. And I think none of us by ourselves can be the solution, but together we've learned that you can be. Thank you.
Angola or Sierra Leone, De Beers does not buy diamonds unless they've been certified, is that right?
Yeah, and there are many myths out there. I mean, one of the problems with De Beers is that we've kept a purposeful low profile for much of that 120 years. And as the old adage goes, if you don't manage your reputation and your image, others will. So a lot of myths have built up. We haven't actually done any business at all in Sierra Leone since 1985, and haven't bought any diamonds from there either. In Angola, we're exploring there. But basically, when the conflict diamond issue arose, we saw very quickly that there was enormous risk for our channels of distribution, and we saw the first thing that we had to do, if we were going to be part of the solution, was to secure our own channels. So we decided fairly swiftly to close down all our outside buying operations around the world, including Angola, which in itself had a cost, because that very much damaged our relationship, funnily enough, with the MPLA government, who we're in partnership with. They were furious that we had taken this unilateral decision to do that, and it took us the best part of the last decade to repair those relationships. So doing the right thing also has a cost. Thanks.